PPSU University. So
Okay.
there I designed a course for liberal arts,
Hmm.
and so I also need your inputs maybe whenever you are free or anything, because we are also implementing a few structures here in Oro too, Oro as well, which I designed there. I developed English major curriculum there, and in that I have designed 18 core and specialization modules.
Okay. Okay. So
Uh,
specializations for English studies in liberal arts, right?
yes, sir. Yes, sir. And it is completely interdisciplinary because I have designed it for the liberal arts studies.
Right. Right.
So for the first 1 month, I was occupied in that in the
Hmm.
month of February. So I wasn't here at all. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, you can share those things that you created for other university. We can see what we can do about it, right? I
yes,
can
sir.
provide things as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Okay, so Shikha, let's have a presentation.
Okay.
It doesn't
Yes.
matter if it's not, you don't feel it's not good enough, because this is not a
Yeah.
kind of, we don't expect you to be very good at it. You just have to find your way around a discourse, right?
Yeah.
And in some way absorb some of the ideas and start looking at things using those ideas. That's the idea behind it. So if there, so don't feel
Yeah.
very tense about it.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I've like basically just written what I understood
Yeah,
from what
yeah.
he
Right, right, right,
wrote. So
right.
okay, I that's I hope you read the essay.
Yeah.
Did you read it?
Not full essay, but I have.
It's
I think
okay. So
all of
after
you have
today's
good essay. Yeah, all.
presentation, you will get a gist of what it is about. So it'll be easier. So yeah. So Eagleton has critiqued several authors in his essay, and he has taken into consideration the social and historical context of the age as well as the author's socio-economic background. He has written about their dealings with the superstructure they're in contact with via their text or whatever their works, be it law, politics, religion, media in the way of newspapers or and literature. So as Marxist thought is in play here, it is to be remembered that Marx considers literature to be a part of the superstructure, and that Marxist critique says that the literature projects certain things and excludes others, a sort of influence like we discussed in our last class. So, Eagleton's main thesis is historical as he outlines the major ideological weaknesses of Victorian capitalism, and at the same time, he uses history to emphasize on the relationship between ideology and literary form. So, but then he draws away from the normal Marxist critique that is reductive in nature as he delves into the author's background. Eagleton's analysis are that of a Marxist theorist, and there is this term, sociology of literature. Uh, okay, so yeah, so when okay, wait, where did I write it? Okay, so yeah, so in each case, Eagleton draws attention to the author's class situation and his ideological dispositions, the author's ideological dispositions, and then he says that these combine to form their literary productions. So, first, he writes about Matthew Arnold. Eagleton considers Matthew Arnold to be a bourgeois thinker. Arnold was against the bourgeois Philistinism. Philistinism describes the manners, habits, and character of a person whose anti-intellectual social attitude undervalues and despises art and beauty, spirituality, and intellect. And Arnold does preach an equal society where culture has eradicated the class system and everybody is equal, and the highest form of intellect means that you are in an equal society. But at the same time, when Arnold writes about his criticism on the society, his criticism has at its forefront the conversion of a visionless sectarian bourgeoisie, one that is full of class differences, one that is anti-intellectual, superficial, and puts significance on material wealth. Arnold insists that it must be the proletariat who enters a state system that is civilizing, so that they can become more refined for society. And so Antonio Gramsci says that the modern proletariat should achieve moral and intellectual leadership as well as material power to get ahead in this world and break the class differences that exist. But instead of thinking about breaking down the bourgeois thought or the classes that exist, Arnold emphasizes on civilized schooling for the proletariat because he feels that by this they too will attain the bourgeois spirit of greatness and nobility. Like this is why Eagleton considers him to be a bourgeois thinker. Uh, then he writes about George Eliot, and here he says that her literary career was in tandem with the socio-economic changes of the 1850s, which marked a period of prosperity for the people. This was after the Depression, I think, and the end of the militantism of the working class, I think, or the workers. So it was a period of prosperity for the people as wages increased, and a familiar but like uh, consequence of this prosperity, which was very political, was the incorporation of the working class. What happened was that from the 1850s, since corporatism became a prominent characteristic uh, of the place, and the industrial bourgeois had begun to take place. You had factories, you had workers, you had those class differences again, but they were being paid. I mean, not that but makes it worth it, but yeah. One second. Okay, so but the thing was that sections of working class began to advance economically because of their increased wages, but at each stage they began to become politically incorporated. So uh, what happened was that every time they advanced to a certain stage or reaches a certain amount of wealth status, they were incorporated by the politics that surrounded that level for them in a way. So this during this time, corporatism had taken hold, and uh, this kind of was the social structure that was existing. So when Eagleton traces Eliot's work, he uh, he emphasizes on the role of nature in it, and he again he brings her social background into this too, that she was the daughter of a farm agent, and because of this uh, the social center for her, which she would focus on or draw from, would be a rural society. So he says that even though she was the daughter of a farm agent, she is still able to see a social order in the structure of a rural life. So Eliot's work has insertions of the pastoral, religious, and romantic thought, which are encompassed into an ideology that is dominated by liberalism, scientific rationalism, and empiricism. She, in a way, when she sees the social order in the structure of a rural life, that is also corporatism at a play in a way. Then he comes to Charles Dickens next, and he considers Dickens to be a petty bourgeois writer too, but he says that instead of being a rural one, he is a urban petty bourgeois writer, and this marks a significant distinction between his work and that of he compares his work to that of George Eliot's and says that both of them did have nature play major roles in their work, but the difference is that uh, in, instead of treating, like, for example, like Eliot finds in nature a socially structured world of rural England, and but instead I'll just quote it here. So instead, he treats nature, but in as this. place of sentimental morality, and he has negated it quite a bit. And instead, he like treats the most available source around him, which is England, the medievalism, or with the contempt of an urban petty bourgeois writer, one for whom there is no satisfactory withdrawal into the mystifications of the pastoral. So Dickens' work is therefore like quite different and full of contradictions, since he does not have an organicist ideology. So we talked about organicism in last class. So I said that organicism is where like you lead the thought of the class you belong to, basically, and you incorporate those ideas. I think. I mean, is that what it was?
Yeah, organicism is a belief that society is a kind of organ
Huh.
in a as a kind of body with
Hmm.
organs. So it's a kind of uh, unity with diverse kind of components, right? But that is not thought of in a mechanistical way, but as like the metaphor uses human body. You have eyes and ears and intestines. All these are different parts, but together it's single body. So there's an organic connection between various parts of your body. So there is a tendency in English thinkers and writers to imagine society, the ideal social order, as an organic order where
Hmm.
it's unified. Now, this is a romantic idea, right? And you find the idea of organic unity in Coleridge and others as well. And it is in tension with the idea of individualism, right? So I emphasis on individualism, rationalism, and the bourgeois ideology, mainstream ideology, and its tension with this. So Romanticism reveals this tension of individualism versus organicism. So you want to be an individual, and for you, individual is important, but the society has to be organically unified. That's kind of vision of man's place in society that romanticists imagined. And
Hmm.
that, according to Eagleton, is a kind of inheritance of romanticism, which has come from German idealism, and it has its basis in tension between aristocracy, which is on decline, and the new bourgeois class, which is on ascendancy, right? So ascendancy is one of the terms that he keeps using.
Hmm.
So and this middle class, the bourgeoisie, that's the pronunciation, is in trying to incorporate or extend its hegemony over working class.
Hmm.
Right? So there are three layers to the society. One is the declining aristocracy, with its all classical values, right? And there is also the bourgeoisie, and the third is the working class, right? So that's the social dynamics underlying post-romantic England that he's talking about. Because romanticism would be something like 1798, preface to lyrical ballads to
Hmm.
1830s, right? And Wordsworth went on to live in 1850s, 60s. He was the poet laureate as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so that is organicism. So, Eagleton says that Dickens is quite different from the ideal petty bourgeoisie thinker, because he says that to be an ideal petty bourgeoisie thinker, one has to be aware of the bourgeoisie ethics that are into play, and as well as the harsh realities they suppress. So he says that Dickens' work does not always show this, and there are a lot of conflicts and contradictions between his thought and what is written in his novels. But at the same time, this adds more color or flavor to his work. and as because these conflicts do get resolved with the addition of experiences to the life of the characters in his novels. So I've just done a brief bit on every
Yeah.
author, yeah. So then we come to Joseph Conrad, and he writes about Conrad's social view. Uh, I think what's it? Emigrate? Is it like an immigrant basically? So Conrad is a Polish origin writer, and his social view is that human societies are essentially criminal organizations of selfish interests, and he is very subjective, and this deep rooted subjectivism with which he sees the world as desperately one that is out to not do good, or basically where the hegemonical rule is hardly beneficial for the ones under it. So he sees this as very cyclical and absurd, and we see this in The Heart of Darkness, where we see a man narrating his tale on the ship, and then the return, like when Kurtz returns to the very country he left, one that he considers criminalistic in its imperialness. This, I think, is also reflected from when he exiled himself from Poland, and he considered it to be a freedom from the intolerable imperial rule that was present there. So I think that was reflected, and so he found it to be very cyclical, and that cyclic nature was what we saw in Heart of Darkness. And there too, in his other novels or works, he considered these organizations or human societies to be criminalistic in nature. We clearly see how he has like termed the imperialistic society to not be without faults. But at the same time, uh, when we were doing Heart of Darkness, Conrad did not really say, something was black and white. He instead felt that the imperial rule, instead of being the worst one, was as bad as it's like, for example, yeah. So when he went to the Congo, that time he considered the natives to be savages and bloodthirsty cannibals. So, but I mean, by the end, he realizes that it is the Westerners, the colonizers, too, are monsters in their own way. But at no point does he say that the ones who are being colonized are not savages or not cannibals. He considers both to be evils or uh, those who have selfish interests in a way. So, like, I think that was also mentioned, and it was something I found intriguing. So then he also writes about T.S. Eliot, and that is where he discusses the wasteland. So the wasteland symbolizes this spiritual emptiness that was born from the First World War, after which this was written. And in the poem, he mentions that Eliot's social situation has not been considered, and this is again like because it is a Marxist approach, the Marxist approach that he does not take. So the question of where Eliot stands in relation to the poem becomes also a question of where he stands in relation to the society he lives in. Like, what is his place exactly? And Eagleton feels that this Marxist approach excludes the poem's form, content, and language because nothing is learnt about the social situations that gave birth to the spirituality it like talks about in a way. So Eagleton says that a modified Marxist approach that is not so reductive, like the one he is using, must be taken into consideration so that the wasteland can be understood better. And as we've been discussing in all these classes, that one needs historical sense to understand something completely, and that is what Eliot also suggests. Uh, then we have W.B. Yeats, and Okay, okay, fine. Just fine. So Yeats belonged by birth to the Protestant bourgeoisie, and so he was doubly dislocated within the Irish society. I think this is probably because I think there were two classes, like so I talked about the ascendancy right now. So he did not belong to them, but he was, yeah, part of the Protestant bourgeoisie. And so during this time, we know about like Yeats. We've done like the No Second Troy, I think. So we know how he started off as an extremely patriotic and nationalistic writer poet, but then he did not really carry that focus onwards. So his uh, right. So I mean, he did start off as symbolizing Ireland as one which is eternally beautiful, and okay, this is confusing.
Just a moment. One moment.
Yeah, yes, sir, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Um, right.
Yeah. So a most important point that you have to look at is what is the relation between the historical context of class conflicts
Hmm.
and the form, literary form. That
Okay.
has to be, the and that has been an eternal problem in literary theory, right? You cannot simply relate historical context with form.
Okay.
And that's why very often it happens that for Marxists, the idea of novel is very important, because novel as a form emerged with the rise of this bourgeoisie out of
Hmm.
the oral epic traditions,
Yeah.
right? Where and the romance traditions of early modernity, of feudalism, where the central protagonist of these narratives was people like King Arthur, and they talked about their adventures and romances. So that was very often the genre of feudal class, right? With the
Hmm.
rise of bourgeoisie, these longer epic narratives were transformed into novels because they express the new worldview, which was secular and more democratic than the feudal structure, right? That is how you have Don Quixote by
Hmm.
Cervantes, which is a novel, which is probably one of the first important novels in the world, right? In the sense that it set a kind of trend, or it's kicked off a genre, and what it describes is the adventures or misadventures of a person who believes that there are still knights around and monsters around and dragons around, because he has read so many romances, but he himself belongs to petty bourgeoisie, right? A
Hmm.
small businessman or a small bureaucrat. Uh, and this person's worldview is in conflict with the social realities, where there are no, uh, what should I say, no knights, right? Because knight is a system associated with feudalism. So he lives in a kind of world that is historically anachronistic because of his
Hmm.
excessive reading of romances. And it describes the misadventures of Don Quixote. And it's also beginning of something called picaresque fiction in English, where Picaro
Right.
is
Moll Flanders.
the rogue, or by rogue you mean a person who has a different value system from the aristocratic and upper sections of society, right? And these
Hmm.
values were largely that of cunningness and uh, cheating, and living a kind of life where devoted to earning money through all sorts of unscrupulous means, right? So Picaro became a central character. So picaresque is a genre in novel. So novel,
Yeah.
the emergence of the form novel in the 16th century from romance and epics is one of the most important form, which is a product of social transformation. So according to Marxist analysis, new forms are product of new forms of social conflicts, right? So the entire survey of English literature that Terry Eagleton gives tries to explore relation between these class dynamics and the genre, the form, right? And he compares how pastoral, which was a classical genre, describing the life of shepherds and the idyllic surroundings of greenery and rural life of pleasure and peace, right? That was the classical genre in Latin, was adapted later on by uh, the modern writers, because it described a kind of society which no longer exists. And they wanted to go back to that society. There is a nostalgia associated with that genre. So how that genre of pastoral re-emerges in writings of George Eliot and Thomas Hardy, right? Because it describes a rural society of innocence and pleasures, innocent pleasures of shepherd life, and as against the heavily industrialized and urbanized spaces that they were inhabiting, right? So it becomes, so you can see that the desire to escape itself is given by social economic development, right? So modernist, modern use of, not modernist, modern use of pastoral, right, is a critical feature of romanticism. If you look at Wordsworth's poetry or the whole Ode to Skylark and Ode to Autumn, there is a desire to run away from urban oppressive realities brought about by industrial revolution, right? So it's not the same genre as the Latin one, because Latin genre was talking about realities of that time, while the modern form is a kind of desire to escape from social realities, at the same time critique and criticize the existing social realities which were seen as oppressive, dirty, pragmatist, and Philistinian, right? What F.R. Lewis would call technologico-Benthamite civilization. That is pragmatist, utilitarian, and materialist culture of the bourgeoisie, which these people are trying to, by these people I mean Wordsworth and Romantics and Matthew Arnold and George Eliot are trying to criticize. And interestingly, George Eliot is a urban, was an urban petty bourgeois, right? And she is writing about organic life in of village society, while Charles Dickens is writing about, he is again urban petty bourgeois who writes about the social realities of industrialized London. Oliver Twist, Great Expectations. City becomes a prominent, industrialized city becomes the prominent feature of his writing. So he's not writing in an escapist kind of, or there is a different take on social realities. So you can either engage with it like Dickens does, or you can create an alternative imagined society, organic society, which George Eliot is doing. So there is correspondence between social cultural realities and the genres. And he points out how Dickens is using multiplicity of genres, right, in his novel. So novel becomes a kind of baggage in which you can include all sorts of forms. So where is it? Let me point out. On yes, page 127, right, and 126. And he's saying that each text, last paragraph of 126, in case of the earlier Charles Dickens, each text is a veritable traffic jam of competing fictional modes. Gothic, romance, moral fable, social problem novel, popular theatre, short story, journalism, episodic entertainment, which permits realism no privileged status. The later development in Charles Dickens is also notably impure kind, which means he is not using realist form only realist novel, but he is combining Gothic and romance and moral fable. So novel as a form is not a singular form, right, of realism, but it is made up of multiplicity of older genres that are pulled together by Charles Dickens. And realism of his later novels produces a kind of totalizing ideology. It is constantly deconstructed from within by scattering effects of quite contrary literary devices, by which he means the devices like Gothic or romance or moral fable. So there is a tension between realism, which aspires towards certain kind of totalization of worldview, right? And realism corresponds to a bourgeois worldview of which is secular and more democratic, rational, pragmatic, right? So realism as a literary what should I say, device or genre or form of writing is corresponding to the rise of new section of society and the worldview and the values or the ideology of that new section, right? And this is what you have to get, that realism we have often understood as just a technique, but this just a technique has a correspondence in the worldview and the values and outlook of a particular section of the society, right? So in a way, he is also critiquing or trying to resolve several contradictions in that ideology. And he then talks about Joseph Conrad, who develops a different form of realism, but his own realism is given by central absence, by which he means that he himself being a Polish exile living in England, there is a kind of imagining of a social organic order, which is that of an exiled person, right? He is not an Englishman, right? So he's a diasporic writer in some sense because he comes from Holland, and how this how his own personal location of being an outsider creates certain kind of contradictions in the novel is what Terry Eagleton talks about. So you can see that the entire discussion of all the writers focuses on contradictions. So if you look at W.B. Yeats, right, then in Yeats you can see the contradiction that he discussed here, that he comes from he reaches back in Ireland of Celtic mythology and early English romantic heritage, right? And he's trying to oppose or critique the bourgeois society to which he belongs, like Wordsworth, like all these writers. Now, this is very important. These writers belong to a particular society, but they are criticizing that society for its materialism, for its pragmaticism, for its lack of spiritual values, for its lack of vision of organic social order, right? But at the same time, they are driven by individualistic tendencies of the same class. So there is a tension with their own social place and its ideology, right? So there is an ambivalence about their own cultural, social place in society. And that is revealed in their writings, according to Terry Eagleton. So he is trying to struggle against the bourgeois hegemony, using the aristocratic idea of culture, which goes back to Celtic mythology. And you can see the turn towards mythology in T.S. Eliot as well, right? And T.S. Eliot is evolving a kind of notion of culture which is extremely elitist, very much like Matthew Arnold. And that's why Terry Eagleton says he is describing a phase of 19th century and early 20th century literature, which is called the culture and society phase of English literature, starting with Matthew Arnold, right? And some of the contradictions would be like this. Right, on page 149, what kind of ideology does Wasteland produce? Then he says that Wasteland tries to talk about decadence and fragmentation of Western civilization, but at the same time it is alluding to the classics and masterpieces like metaphysical poets, Dante, Shakespeare, Middleton, Marvel, right? Which implies that the reader knows these texts, right? So the audience of Wasteland is a cultured audience, right? Which has this knowledge of the tradition, right? Of great literature, which means that there is still a cultured class for which he is writing. So on one hand, he is talking about decadent civilization, but then he is addressing the reader who is culturally as elitist and as well read as he is, right? That is a contradiction. Can you see this as a contradiction? He says that culture has deteriorated, but his implied audience, if you want to use that word, he is a cultured audience. That's the contradiction, right? On one hand, it talks about how history is sterile. Nothing grows up. I don't know if you have studied Wasteland or Prufrock, for example. You have not studied T.S. Eliot?
I mean, like we've not done like Prufrock. I mean, Khushi had a presentation on him, but we didn't study him. And I
Right.
think we did do the Wasteland.
Yeah. So Wasteland, one of the ideas of Wasteland is that the Western society is sterile. It cannot produce spiritual love. It cannot. It can only produce mechanistic sex, right? It cannot produce creative genius. It can only produce a wasteland, right? Nothing useful grows out of wasteland. But at the same time, it is, as a poem is produced from the same civilization, right? That's another contradiction, which seems to oppose what he is saying. So if you say nothing useful grows out of wasteland, then what about wasteland as a poem? Right, which is a product of the same history. I hope you get the contradictions here that Eagleton is talking about. So
Yes,
he's
yes.
talking
I
about
mean,
these kind of, yeah, go on.
when I was like going through the essay after yesterday's discussion, I could understand it a bit better. But like when you put it
Hmm.
like this, I realized this is how one should actually speak about an essay like this. So I mean, I
Right.
understood that right now, but I understood it better again.
You
So
are
yeah,
learning, right? You are able to learn these things.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And you can see everywhere throughout his assessment, and you can compare this with F.R. Lewis' book called Great Tradition, right, which tries to say that these writers, very much same writers, are just a moment. Yeah. So throughout the essay, if you can see, right, then he is focusing on contradictions in the text, right, how they correspond to the contradictions in the life of that person and the state of the society. So literature in some way tries to resolve these contradictions in everyday life and thus produce its own ideology, right, which is also contradictory. It is an unsuccessful attempt to resolve those problems of actual everyday life, even if they are fictional, through these genres, right? He is I think can be a summary of this detailed analysis. And as I was saying, you can compare it with the idea, the book called Revaluations or The Great Traditions by F.R. Lewis, which says that literature from Jane Austen onwards is a repository of great cultural humanistic values, which are being eroded because of the bourgeois society. Right? At the same time, they are products of the bourgeois society. Right? So there is that ambivalence towards one's own culture and one's own value system in which you are born. On one hand, you embody some of the ideas of that class to which you belong. At the same time, you are criticizing those class values. Right? For example, you may have to answer, or you may have some difficulty in talking to people who ask you, why are you studying arts? Because the class to which we belong is a utilitarian class, a materialist class which believes that humanities का कोई फायदा नहीं, right? So STEM subjects बहुत important है, right? You come from that class which lays great emphasis on STEM value. STEM because it's practical, it gives you good jobs and it has good money and social status and so on and so forth. Right? या तो arts के subjects लड़कियों के लिए है. Kind of a value system to which the Indian middle class belongs, right? Is not very enthusiastic about arts and liberal arts and humanities. So there is a contradiction there, right? So while you do select arts, you are critiquing the values of your own class. But at the same time, there are certain values of the same class which you have imbibed. Right? So there is a contradictory or ambivalent relationship between your class and you. So when you write for your own class, these tensions very often show up.
And even it also happens with even like with professors also. Like when I was taking my admission in liberal arts in Oriental University, the fees of liberal arts is like about 1.5 lakhs. So some of my papa's friends say that, why are you giving 1.5 lakhs in arts?
For arts,
Yeah.
Right. So you can see that value is decided by price. Right. So,
Yes, sir.
That's the ideology of the class. Because arts is supposed to be inferior. Supposed to be. I'm not saying it is. So that is an example. So you can see how and class analysis is very important to understanding of culture. Now that is not the only way, and there are bad ways of doing class analysis, right? Or reductive ways of doing Marxism. But Marxism is a very important intervention in thinking about society and culture, right? And it does not see culture as the high aristocratic values, right? And that is its critique. Which it sees as a bourgeois attempt to appropriate aristocratic values, right? The feudal values, in order to sustain its own hegemony. That's a Marxist understanding of high culture, right? I hope you get what I'm saying. Marxist critique of high culture is that it sees it as a kind of bourgeois appropriation of feudal values to establish its own dominance and superiority in the society over the working class. Now, this is what it is in the West. Now, do you think in India you have similar parallels? Because in India, along with class, one of the complicating social reality is that of caste. Caste is an important formation, or caste is an important social stratification, structure of social stratification, right? And class is, there is a basic conflict between idea of class and caste. Caste says that your place in society is predetermined by the family you are born into, while class says that your place in society is a function of how much wealth you earn, right? So if you earn more, then you will go upwards in society, but caste says that it's exactly the opposite. So one of the basic contradictions in Indian society is caste and its relation to class. You have to distinguish between caste and class. They are not parallel. In fact, they are contradictory. So class values क्या होती है? मैं पैसे ज्यादा कमाऊंगा तो मेरी सोसाइटी में रिस्पेक्ट बढ़ेगी, right? That's the class value. Caste says that your value is predetermined by the family and the caste that you are born into. So you cannot change it. It is unchangeable and fixed in theory, not in practice, right? So you can see the ideological basis of caste and ideological basis of class are entirely different, right? So when we try to think of Marxism in Indian context, we cannot just merely use the idea of class. And you will see that people who are rich and powerful in India, people of higher classes, are very often people of upper castes. Not always so, but very often. And people who are doing manual labor are still people who were condemned to belong to lower caste, right? People who do scavenging work were people who are doing this from hundreds of years. So class and caste have strange kind of relation in Indian context. So Marxism seems to make some sense in the Western context. When you bring it blindly, you adopt Marxism in Indian context, it becomes a big problem. We cannot really understand how class works without taking on board question of caste.
Yes, sir, it's correct, because if we see, then mostly all the rickshawalas in Gujarat also, like they belongs to a lower caste. When people used to say, "Yeah, I am from Dalit, I am Dalit, I am Dalit," and even sir, the Dalits are also not getting houses where upper class used to stay.
Again, you're using word upper class, right? So
Yes, sir,
class
this
has
is
some
the
relation to caste. You should
hmm,
not confuse between the two because they are contradictory ideologies.
hmm.
क्लास क्या कहता है कि आप पैसे कमाओ तो आप समाज में ऊंचा स्थान प्राप्त करोगे.
Yeah, so I said upper caste, not upper
Ah,
class.
right.
Upper caste. Yeah.
So you have to be careful while talking about classes in India. And Dalit is a category which came into prominence in the 40s, 50s in a certain way. The word Dalit used to exist in 19th century to indicate people who were oppressed irrespective of their caste or class locations. But after Dr. Ambedkar's intervention, Dalits stood for those castes which were stigmatized or condemned as untouchables, right? And the awareness that they got because of Ambedkarite thought, they called themselves Dalit instead of Harijan or instead of other labels that people like Gandhi used to use, right? Because you can see that there is some form of condensation when you say Harijan, यानी आप हरि के जन है तो आप किसके जन हो, right? All these questions came up. Just a moment. Yeah. So Marxism, while it had some kind of important intervention in Western thinking about culture, in Indian context, when we think about culture, and we have to complicate the idea of culture using not just idea of caste, but also idea of class, dono ka, and obviously gender as the third important determinant of culture. So if culture has multiple determinants, it's called over-determined. That's the term used by Eagleton throughout its writing, right? The word that he has taken from Althusser to indicate that there is no simple one-to-one cause-effect relation between culture and class, but there are multiple factors which affect culture, right? So in India, when we think of culture, we think of culture without reference to caste and class? Can we do that? Or gender?
Course, like, I don't think we can even exclude religion from that debate in
Religion,
India.
right?
Like,
No, you are very true.
so, yeah. I mean, somehow they're all very, it's this tapestry where everything is interconnected in India at
Mm,
least.
No, everywhere it is, but in India more so.
Yeah. Is it because of the so like the diversity we have in India that it is so much more prominent? This
Yes, yes. India is extremely diverse in terms of languages, religions, sects, sectarian beliefs, castes, classes, uh, various kind of racial and ethnic diversities. Like people from northeast have a different kind of ethnicity and racial structure compared to, say, for example, people in south, compared to, say, for example, people in Punjab, and different kind of uh, cultural. So one thing that we have to understand, that thinking about culture is being complicated by Marxist and Freudian interventions in a major way. Because culture in Matthew Arnold is the high elitist culture, Mahan Sanskruti, right? Going back to Dante, Shakespeare, and touchstone method that he uses to evaluate kind of various literary works, right? And that, according to people like Eggleton, is something that Matthew Arnold is doing from the traditionalists, that is the feudal aristocrat classes, which are on decline. So he's taking ideological baggage from them and trying to establish the bourgeois hegemony, right? That is Eagleton's assessment of uh, Matthew Arnold and his idea of culture over the working class. Because according to Matthew Arnold, the Philistines, that is the materialist bourgeoisie of his own class, as well as working class, did not have culture, right? And religion is taking the back seat in the Western society. So culture should step in uplifting, spiritually uplifting these sections of society. So Eagleton is uncovering the politics of culture, to revealing that culture is a political construct. By political, we mean there is a question of power involved, power of class ideology and hegemony, right? And there is a kind of appropriation of feudal cultural values in service of bourgeois values to establish superiority of bourgeoisie and hegemony. So that is the politics of idea of culture, according to Terry Eagleton, that you find in the culture and society ideology that he examines in writers like Matthew Arnold to D.H. Lawrence. And D.H. Lawrence is the only writer coming from working class, right? And even then, he reveals ideology which is at odds with his own working class position. So, according to Gramsci, D.H. Lawrence would be something called organic intellectual. intellectual who is organic to a particular class, not an outsider, right? That means he is an intellectual coming from working class background, right? But his ideology is at odds with his own location, right? So these are the contradictions. So Eagleton's emphasis is that you can't reduce these things very simply. You can't reduce class ideology and ideology that you find in literary texts.
So when he so this is when he's spoken about how he's a proletariat, D.H. Lawrence. So
Proletariat light, right?
So the contradiction is faced because he writes opposite to that of it. I mean,
Yeah. His value system is that organicist values of nature. There is a heavy romanticism in his writings. Romanticism, which is typical of bourgeois or feudal society, right? And he is using Freud, and he is talking about individualism of certain kinds, organicism of certain kinds, though coming from working class. That is Eagleton's analysis. So politics of culture in Matthew Arnold is different from politics of culture in D.H. Lawrence. Is different from politics of culture in Americans who have gone over to England like Henry James and T.S. Eliot, and expatriates or exiles like Joseph Conrad, who has come from Poland and settled in England. Right, so he's analyzing how the personal, social location and ideology, and the ideology of text is very often at odds with each other.
Okay.
But at the same time, it embodies those values. It embodies the social values of the class to which it belongs. So just like your selection of arts would be a kind of critique of your own class, but at the same time there is a kind class values that you have internalized, which can be found in your own understanding of literature and culture. Yes, no, maybe.
Sorry, sir.
The question I ask is that when you select arts and humanities, you are in some way challenging the class values to which you belong.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But at the same time, your understanding of arts and literature is shaped by the values of your own class.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Correct, sir.
Right. So, how do you see this for yourself?
I mean, probably the founding stone is, class values, but then I think, it's again the same thing. Like you go out, you actually understand what it is about, and then the building grows the way you want it to. So, in a way, I suppose.
So, you can see that lot of theory, right, as we call it, is about questioning our own assumptions about literature and culture. Right? We are looking at, in some way, we are self-reflexive in humanities. We are exploring ourselves when you study humanities, because we are human beings. Right? Something that is not possible in STEM subjects, because then in STEM subjects you are studying a subject in which you are not the subject. When you are studying medicine or you are studying physics, chemistry, biology, the fact that what does it mean or what is it to be a human being is not a question that is addressed in those subjects. But in humanities, we focus on that. So it tends to become self-reflexive. right? So theory is a kind of product of humanities. It's interdisciplinary, as you can see. He is relying on social and cultural history, economic history, political history to discuss literature. Like Freudians would use psychoanalysis, which is a method for analyzing uh, human psyche, for treating the patients largely, to understand literature. Right. So recent developments in humanities include something like medical humanities.
Ahmad.
How can you use ideas of medical science to understand human beings, and how can humanities help people studying medicine? What can humanities offer to those people who are studying medicine? Right? What do novels about plague and pandemics tell doctors, for example, about social and cultural impact of the disease? Or the other way around, what can medical science tell us about novels which are uh, or short stories about pandemic? Right. So medical humanities is an upcoming field, which is intersection between humanities and medical science. So you can see theory and humanities is deeply interdisciplinary. Okay, so what we will do next week, we will have a presentation maybe on psychoanalysis, and you can ask someone from your class to do it, and share the videos in class as well, because there are many students who seem to have missed, like Pankti has missed because of certain personal issues. Right, and others may have missed. Amatullah is also not visible these days. So
Yes.
if there are difficulties that you people are facing, then please bring them to class, because then we can resolve. Because you may be not attending also, some of you may not be attending because you may find certain things difficult to understand or challenging. So in such a situation, it's a good idea to bring those things along which confront you or challenge you, without worrying about whether I will look an idiot or feel stupid, right? Because it's good to be stupid for 2 minutes in the classroom than to spend rest of your life being stupid, right?
Yes.
So and plus, what you think is stupid may not be stupid.
Hmm.
मैं ये मुझे समझ में नहीं है कैसे मैं पूछ सकता हूँ, मगर that doesn't mean there is a problem with you, right? It may be that it's a difficult, complex idea, or the author has not been able to clarify many of the things. That is also a possibility, right? So that is also something that you need to look into. It's not that always that आपको अकल कम है इसलिए समझ में नहीं आया. That's not the case.
हाँ हाँ.
Most of the times, yeah. Okay, so anything that you have to say or ask before we close for today?
No, sir, but
Huh.
so on which topic like students have to present in next
Psychoanalysis.
cycle?
Analysis,
Yeah, yeah. Okay, then sir.
because we had a general discussion on it.
Hmm.
So, Tatsam, you have also lost on some of the classes. You can listen to them and bring the doubts
Sure, sir.
to the class.
We'll do that. And sir, what does Marx believe on democracy and monarchy?
That's very interesting question. Monarchy was a social system which, in some way, reflected the power of aristocracy.
Hmm.
Right? Monarchy came into existence after feudalism collapsed. Right? If you look at the history of the Western political history of West, Then you have the earliest ideas of city-states or polis in Greece, right? Which is very different from the idea of nation-state that we have today. City-state is, city itself is seen as a nation or state, like Sparta or Athens or so many other things, right? And that became an empire because of Alexander, right? Greece became an empire. And then after it collapsed, Rome, which was a republic similar to Greeks, became an empire. And by 4th century after Christ, you find that Roman Empire collapses because of various Germanic tribes, whom they called Vandals and Goths and others, attacked Rome, and Rome was destroyed. And these tribes started assimilating classical ideas, but they could not develop an empire. They developed a system called feudalism, which was largely a hierarchic system, agriculture based, unlike Greek and Romans, which were trade based. Right? Their trading was extensive. So this agricultural structure of polity, with king as the biggest landlord having most of land, and the hierarchy of intermediary right up to the peasant at the bottom. And there was hardly any possibility of social mobility, right? And it coincided with the Roman Catholic religion that became prominent. But because of things like Black Plague, now that we are discussing pandemics, right? And crusades and things like that, the feudal society started disintegrating. And from that arose something called monarchy, the question that you are talking about. Right? So monarchy is where the sovereign has sole power in his hands, unlike feudalism where king had a limited power in his hand. His knights and his vassals had various powers, right? Something called parcelized sovereignty, means he did not have absolute power. Monarchs like Tudors had a great amount of power, was centralized in Queen Elizabeth or Henry VIII and all those powerful monarchs, James I, Charles I in England, right? And in France, you had Bourbons, Louis the 15th and 16th. Now, Marx says that this monarchy was undermined, and this is not what Marx says, this is what happened in the West, right? By the rise of the new section called the bourgeoisie, the middle class, which was mercantile capitalist to start with, later on becoming industrial capitalist. And these people undermined king's authority, so that parliament starts getting more and more power. So in England, there is a civil war between parliament and the king, in which king was executed, and later on he had to be brought back. Charles II was restored, and that is the restoration that you might have studied in your history of English literature. You have studied these things? Restoration.
Yeah, we've done restoration. Yes.
So this parliament became a kind of expression of the bourgeoisie against the power of aristocratic king or royalty. And slowly, as it degraded, democracy, where parliament has the most power, became the prominent form of political form. So coming back to the essay, he talks about reform bills. Right? Reform bills in the 19th century, starting with 1830s, where parliament starts opening it up to people partially. So right to vote is extended to men who are aristocrats, rich. Then it goes to bourgeoisie and then the workers. And it takes several decades of 20th century that women have to agitate for right to voting. Something called suffrage movement in 20th century. So suffrage was women's right to vote. So women had to fight to get right to vote. right? Something which was given free of cost to Indians. But in West, they had to fight to get right for voting. So this democracy was seen as an expression of bourgeoisie. So state, the bourgeois state, right, uses the ideas of democracy to maintain its own hegemony. That's the Marxist analysis of democracy. So state is seen as a kind of rich man's property, right? So state is seen as an expression of capitalism by Marx, and that has to be destroyed. And a communist state will come where there will be no private property, no class distinction. Such kind of state will be true democracy according to Marx, but that will be also that will be preceded by the dictatorship of proletariat or the workers' dictatorship, and that is what happened in Russia and China, Chinese Revolution and Russian Revolution, where proletariat dictatorship was established. So democracy as a bourgeois democracy is Marx is extremely hostile to it. He sees it as capitalistic ideology. Right? Good question, but you have this linear understanding of history coming from Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So thesis is capitalism, antithesis is the revolution, and synthesis is the communist state. So it's a Hegelian understanding of history. So he is anti-democratic, anti-bourgeois democracy. Any other question, Tatsam, before we stop? Shikha?
No, sir.
No, sir. No.
Okay, so we meet next week at 1 as usual.
Yes.
Yes, so
Sir, not at
Thursday? No.
yes. No, sir. We will like on Friday.
I'm sorry, on Friday, 11 o'clock. 11:30.
Oh, okay.
And
Friday.
Friday at what time?
11.
11.
I mean, yesterday. We're repeating yesterday's
Right,
time
11 to
slot.
1 on Friday, right?
Yeah. Okay.
You have other classes that are scheduled, right?
I think, yeah, on Thursday. I don't think we have anything on Friday. Anything.
No, no, we have it on Friday. Because
Haha, very.
New
Friday
lectures?
too. Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, so have a good weekend and take care.
Yes, sir.
thank you,
And
sir. Bye,
start
sir.
picking these things up parallelly.
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
And I was just making a note on the side of the things I need to Google and read up on later.
Read
So,
up whatever you have heard.
yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
yeah.
you, sir. Bye,
Thank
sir.
you, sir.
Well.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Shikha. Yeah, bye.